October 14th, 1984, Harmony Creek, Georgia. The morning air hung thick and heavy, smelling of damp earth and yesterday's rain. Detective Alistair Russo, his cheap suit already sticking to his back, stood on the cracked pavement and stared at a door. It was old, the blue paint peeling to reveal generations of colors beneath, set into the weathered brick face of a small shop. Behind it was a quilting workshop, a simple, unassuming place, one of dozens of craft shops that dotted the historic district. A faded wooden sign, hand-carved, swung silently in the humid breeze. Miller Sisters, Fine Quilts. The scent of dyed cotton and old wood seeped through the doorframe. Nothing special. Russo had flown in from Chicago the night before on a special government flight. No luggage, just a single manila folder in his hand. Inside that folder was a photograph. Special Agent Victor Pierce, FBI, 42 years old. He'd come to Harmony Creek 9 days ago on personal leave, buying a quilt for his mother. A simple, wholesome errand. He never checked out of his room at the Savannah Inn. His things were still there, his service weapon and credentials locked in the manager's safe. His return ticket to D.C. was for the day after tomorrow. 9 days of absolute silence. For a regular person, maybe it meant something else. A bender, a sudden trip, a forgotten phone call. But an FBI agent doesn't just vanish for 9 days. He doesn't have that luxury. After 3 days of silence, the Bureau started making quiet calls. After 5, they looped in the local field office. After 7, the call went to Chicago, to Russo, the man they sent when things got strange and ugly. And now, here he was, standing in front of this quaint little shop, a search warrant signed by a local judge folded in his pocket. Behind him, 4 grim-faced agents and the local police chief, a man named Bill Cobb, who was pale as a sheet and couldn't seem to stop the tremor in his hands. Cobb knew this family. The Millers, 3 sisters, quilters, quiet, hardworking, respected. He'd bought a baby quilt from them for his own granddaughter's christening. Russo knocked 3 times, firm and official. Silence. Then, the sound of soft, unhurried footsteps. The door creaked open. On the threshold stood a woman who looked to be in her late 60s. She was thin, with deep-set lines etched around her eyes and mouth. She looked older than her years. Her gaze passed over the detective, the federal agents, and landed on Chief Cobb, a flicker of recognition in her dark eyes. Then, she looked back at Russo and asked, in a calm, even voice laced with a gentle southern drawl, "Would you gentlemen care for some sweet tea?" Russo had been a cop for 23 years. He'd interrogated killers, sociopaths, and monsters who wore human skin. He had seen the eyes of men being led to the execution chamber. But that question, "Would you care for some sweet tea?" at the sight of 6 armed men on your doorstep at dawn, was something he would remember for the rest of his life. 2 hours later, in a small back storeroom, they found a flawed quilt, rolled up and tied with twine. Inside was the body of Special Agent Victor Pierce. 2 weeks after that, a cadaver dog named Atlas would lead a team of investigators to an old, abandoned well behind a ruined pre-Civil War plantation house 4 miles out of town. What they would pull from that well would make Detective Russo, a man who had investigated dozens of horrific cases and thought he'd seen it all, step away behind the crumbling brick wall of a smokehouse and stand there in utter silence for a full 10 minutes. 25 handmade quilts, each one a makeshift coffin, stacked neatly, one on top of the other, like inventory in a warehouse. But to understand how 3 quiet, unassuming quilters from Harmony Creek, Georgia, became the most prolific female serial killers in American history, we have to go back 20 years to 1964, to the summer when it all began. If you are someone who values true stories, not fiction, but cases that were buried under decades of silence, then stay with me. This story is worth the telling. Harmony Creek, a town that felt older than it was, a place that remembered the Civil War not as history, but as family lore, a town built on cotton and textiles, where the ghosts of the past clung to the Spanish moss dangling from ancient oaks. By the mid-1960s, it was a sleepy county seat, population just under 15,000. Two distinct realities coexisted within its borders. There was the new Harmony Creek, the post-war America of straight, paved streets, brick ranch houses, the majestic cinema, the Piggly Wiggly, and the diner with its 1 5-cent coffee. Portraits of President Johnson hung in the post office. High school kids in Letterman jackets drove Ford Falcons. Life looked like a Norman Rockwell painting. And then there was the Old Town, the historic district, a labyrinth of cobblestone alleys and brick-walled lanes so narrow 2 cars couldn't pass. Ornate iron gates that were a century and a half old. Behind those gates were hidden courtyards with overgrown gardens, stone fountains, and wide, shaded porches. The air smelled of magnolia blossoms and slow-cooked barbecue. Old men in straw hats sat on park benches, debating politics and baseball. Women in bright floral dresses gossiped over garden fences. Kids chased lightning bugs in glass jars at dusk. This part of town wasn't just a neighborhood. It was a world unto itself, closed, self-sufficient, living by its own unwritten rules. Here, everybody knew everybody's business. A wedding was an event for the entire town. A funeral was a cause for the whole street to bring casseroles and pound cake. And here, you did not meddle in your neighbor's affairs. What happened behind a closed door stayed behind that closed door. It wasn't malice. It was tradition, a respect for privacy, or, if you were less generous, a conspiracy of silence. In an old brick building on a dead-end street, tucked behind the First Baptist Church, was the workshop. A small house, really. In the backyard, 2 massive quilting frames stood under a tin-roofed awning. The hand-carved sign read Miller Sisters Fine Quilts. The letters were faded, but everyone in the county knew. This was where you went for the best quilts in the state, maybe in the entire South. In this part of Georgia, quilting wasn't just a craft, it was a legacy. Skills were passed from mother to daughter, from grandmother to granddaughter. Patterns were kept in memory, not on paper. A single quilt could take 6 months of work. Fine cotton thread, natural dyes, walnut hulls for brown, indigo for blue, pokeberries for a deep magenta. Every stitch was done by hand. A good heirloom quilt from Harmony Creek could have over 50,000 stitches. And a quilt like that cost money. A lot of money, by the standards of the day. $3,000, maybe $5,000 for a masterpiece. With the average salary around $500 a month, that was nearly a year's wages for an ordinary man. So, the buyers were not ordinary people. They were wealthy collectors from Atlanta or New York, dealers in fine antiques, sometimes even foreign tourists guided by local connoisseurs. These people came to Harmony Creek with cash, a lot of cash. In those days, it was normal. Credit cards were for department stores, not artisans. Wire transfers were slow and complicated. Cash was king. A man would fly in from Chicago or Boston with a briefcase stuffed with $5,000, $6,000, $7,000. He'd choose a quilt, pay in crisp bills, and arrange to have it shipped. A common transaction. Common, that is. As long as the man went home, the Miller family had been making quilts in that very building for 3 generations. Their grandfather, Jedediah Miller, founded the workshop at the turn of the century. In his day, Miller quilts were known from Charleston to New Orleans. His son, Thomas, continued the business, a short, wiry man with fingers permanently stained by indigo dye. He could judge the quality of cotton by touch alone and tell if a frame was properly tensioned just by the sound of a plucked thread. Thomas and his wife Sarah had 3 daughters. In the rural South of the 1960s, a family with no sons was a quiet tragedy. Not a catastrophe, but a constant low-grade sorrow. Neighbors offered their sympathies in hushed tones. Relatives suggested he should have kept trying for a boy. Thomas refused. "The Lord gave me daughters," he'd say, "and that's what was meant to be." He proceeded to teach them the craft with the same rigor he would have taught sons. Clara, the eldest, was born in 1923. From childhood, she was serious, silent, and possessed a surprising physical strength. By the time she was 10, her stitches were as fine and even as any grown woman's. By 15, she could stretch the heavy backing on a quilting frame by herself, a job that usually required two strong men. She was not a pretty woman. Her face was plain, with wide cheekbones, thin lips, and small dark eyes. Other girls whispered about her, calling her an old maid before she was even 20. But her hands were golden, precise, strong, tireless. She could quilt for 12 hours without a break. In 1951, Clara married a man named Roy Sullivan, a handsome, charming, and utterly shiftless mechanic from the next town over. He didn't marry Clara for love. He married her for the workshop, for the steady income it provided. Roy loved money far more than he loved his wife. A year later, he was gone. He packed a bag while Clara was at the market and drove off to Texas with a waitress from the local diner. He left no note, said no goodbye. He simply vanished. Clara came home to an empty closet. She didn't cry. She didn't scream. She didn't tear at her hair. She walked to her quilting frame, sat down, and began to stitch. She worked for 3 days straight without stopping. No food, no water, no sleep. Her mother had to physically pull her away on the 4th day. From that moment on, Clara never spoke a kind word about any man. In fact, she began to speak very little at all. She worked, she ate, she slept. That was all. The neighbors decided she'd gotten over it. A strong woman, it happens. Nora, the middle sister, was born in 1926. She was the complete opposite of Clara. She was beautiful, truly beautiful, not just pretty, with large, dark eyes, high cheekbones, and thick black hair that fell to her waist. As a teenager, boys from all over the county would try to court her. Her father chased them off with a broom. Nora was outgoing, charming, and knew how to talk to people, locals, city folk, Yankees. She had a way with words that could charm a snake out of its skin. She was the one who greeted the customers, showed them the quilts, told them the stories behind the patterns, and negotiated the price. She was the face of the Miller sisters' fine quilts. In 1958, she married Ray Miller, a worker from the local textile mill. For the first 2 years, things were fine. Then Ray started to drink, not just beer cheap bourbon, the kind that came in a plastic jug. He drank every night. At first, he'd just get quiet and sullen. Then came the shouting. Then came the fists. Nora endured it. In her world, a wife endured. It was what you did. It was how she was raised. Her mother had endured. Her neighbors endured. To complain was a disgrace. To leave was impossible. Divorce would bring a stain upon the entire family. So she endured it for 6 years. During that time, she gave birth to 2 children. Both died in infancy. The first from a fever, the second from pneumonia. The county hospital, an overworked doctor, a shortage of modern medicine. It was a common story in the rural South of the 1960s. Ray's reaction to the death of his children was the same both times. He got drunk. On the 3rd day after the second baby's funeral, he came home drunk and hit Nora across the face, splitting her lip. Her crime? His dinner was cold. Maeve, the youngest, was born in 1931. When she was 5, she fell into the creek that ran behind the house. It was swollen with spring rain, the current strong. The water dragged her 20 yards downstream before a neighbor pulled her out. She had swallowed a lot of water and was unconscious. They revived her, but after that day, Maeve was different. She became quiet, withdrawn. She had a gentle, placid smile that would appear at odd times in the middle of a serious conversation, or late at night when everyone else was asleep. The doctor at the county clinic said it was a consequence of oxygen deprivation. He said, "She'll grow out of it." She never did. Maeve never married. No one came calling. Everyone in town knew she was a little touched. It wasn't meant cruelly. It was simply a statement of fact. In a small town, such things were spoken of plainly, but Maeve's hands were perhaps the most gifted in the family. Even better than Clara's. The most intricate patterns, the double wedding ring, the mariner's compass, the Carolina lily, were entrusted only to her. She could sit at a frame for hours, head bowed, her fingers moving with a precision that seemed guided by some internal, invisible rhythm. Her father used to say, "Maeve's hands can see better than most people's eyes." In 1958, their father died. A heart attack, right at his quilting frame. He fell forward onto an unfinished quilt, dead at 59. The workshop passed to his daughters. In 1961, their mother died. Sarah faded away in 3 short months. Cancer. They caught it too late. The county hospital didn't have the equipment. Before she died, she called her daughters to her bedside and told them 2 things. First, you stick together. You're all you've got in this world. Second, don't ever trust a man, not a one. By then, Clara already didn't. Nora was still enduring her husband's fists, and Maeve just smiled her faraway smile and said nothing. The 3 sisters were left alone. The workshop, 2 quilting frames, a stock of cotton and thread, nothing more. No husbands, no protectors, no sons. 3 women in a world that belonged to men. They continued to quilt. Their work was still the best in Harmony Creek. The buyers still came, the money still trickled in, and life went on. But something was changing, slowly, imperceptibly, like a crack in a foundation that will one day bring the whole house down. In 1964, 3 years after their mother's death, an event occurred that changed everything. An event so mundane in its beginning and so monstrous in its conclusion that years later, even a seasoned detective like Al Russo would find it hard to believe. The night of March 12th, 1964, Harmony Creek. Around 11 o'clock, Ray Miller came home drunk, as usual. 3/4 of a bottle of cheap bourbon shared with a buddy from the mill. His friend stayed on the bar stool. Ray staggered home, bracing himself against the brick walls of the alleyways. He tripped, fell, cursed, and shoved open the kitchen door. Nora was sitting at the table, waiting. She always waited, not out of love, but out of fear. She needed to gauge his mood. If he was a happy drunk, he'd eat and pass out. If he was an angry drunk, there would be bruises. If he was a quiet drunk, that was the most dangerous. A quiet drunk was a thinking drunk, and when Ray thought while he was drunk, he invented grievances, imagined slights that had never occurred. That night, he was quiet. He walked in, sat heavily at the table, and looked at the plate of fried chicken and biscuits Nora had made 2 hours earlier. It was cold. "What's this?" Ray slurred. "It's your dinner," Nora replied. "This ain't dinner. This is garbage." He swept the plate off the table. The heavy ceramic platter, a wedding gift, hit the floor and shattered. Greasy chicken skittered across the linoleum. "Clean it up," Ray ordered. Nora knelt down, picking up the pieces of chicken and broken plate with her hands. She looked up and saw Ray unbuckling his belt, not to take off his pants. This was the moment Nora would later describe to Detective Russo, calmly, in a steady voice. 20 years after that night, I saw the belt, and I thought, he's going to hit me now, and tomorrow he'll hit me again, and the day after that, again, and it'll keep going until I'm dead, 'cause he's never gonna stop. He's strong, he's healthy, he'll keep hitting me until I die, or until he kills the next baby I might carry. I had 2 seconds, and I used them. On the kitchen counter lay a cast iron skillet, heavy and black. Nora grabbed it with both hands and swung it with all her strength, hitting her husband across the side of the head. Ray collapsed, his temple striking the sharp corner of the wooden table on his way down. He made a gurgling sound, twitched once, and then fell silent. Nora stood over him, watching. For a minute, maybe two. The skillet still in her hand, the cold chicken on the floor. Blood, slowly pooling on the linoleum from the gash on his temple. Then she walked across the yard, through the dark workshop, and into the small bedroom where Clara and Maeve were sleeping. She woke them and said 5 words. Ray's in the kitchen. He's dead. Clara got up without a word. She went to the kitchen, looked, came back. He's dead, she confirmed. Good. Maeve just smiled, her usual disconnected smile. The 3 sisters sat in the dim kitchen until dawn. They didn't cry. They didn't panic. They didn't call for help. They thought, or rather, Nora thought. She had always been the thinker for the 3 of them. The plan was simple. Ray Miller was a drunk and a brawler, a fact known to the whole town. He was always talking about leaving, about heading out west to find work, to get away from this one-horse town. Everyone had heard him say it. Everyone knew. That morning, Nora went next door to their neighbor, Mrs. Gable, an elderly widow who had lived on that street for 70 years and knew everything about everyone. Ray's left, Nora said, her voice steady. Gone to Texas to work the oil fields. She said he'd left her $100 and took off. Mrs. Gable just nodded. About time, she said. That man was a curse. Maybe some hard work will straighten him out. No one asked any questions. No one checked. A drunk left town. Good riddance. The local sheriff made a note in his log. Ray Miller departed for seasonal work. Case closed. The sisters wrapped Ray's body in a quilt, a flawed one, with a mistake in the pattern, the kind they would never sell. That night, using an old wheelbarrow, they moved the body out of town. 4 miles down a dirt road, behind the ruins of an old plantation, was an abandoned well. It was dry, deep, maybe 50 feet down. It had once watered the fields. Now, only hunters and stray dogs knew it was there. The bundle landed at the bottom with a dull, final thud. Maeve tossed in a handful of dirt. Clara turned the wheelbarrow around. Nora walked last, looking back over her shoulder. They returned before sunrise, scrubbed the kitchen floor, sat down at their quilting frames, and began to work. Just like that, without drama or hysterics, the 3 sisters from Harmony Creek became murderers. Not maniacs, not psychopaths, not monsters driven by some insatiable bloodlust. Just 3 women who had solved a problem in the only way that seemed possible to them. If the story had ended there, 1 murder, an abusive husband, an act of self-defense, it might have been understandable, maybe even forgivable. But the story didn't end there. It was just beginning, because Ray Miller gave the Miller sisters something far more dangerous than bruises and fear. He gave them proof. Proof that you could kill a man and nothing would happen. The world wouldn't end. The police wouldn't come. The neighbors wouldn't notice. Life would go on. The quilts would be stitched. The sweet tea would be brewed. And the sun would rise over Harmony Creek, just as it always had. That knowledge is the most terrifying thing that can happen to a person in whom something vital has already broken. For 4 years after Ray's murder, life was quiet. The sisters quilted. The workshop operated. Buyers came and went. Nora greeted them, showed them the quilts, haggled over prices. Clara stitched. Maeve stitched. Everything was as it had been, but Nora was watching. She had always been observant, but after Ray's death, her attention sharpened. She noticed how the out-of-town buyers behaved. They almost always came alone, men with money. They'd check into the local inn, but rarely told the front desk where they were going. They bought quilts with cash $3,000, $5,000, sometimes $6,000, and then they left. No one knew exactly when. No one saw them off. Nora thought about this. Not all at once. The idea formed slowly, like a pattern on a quilt, stitch by stitch. She didn't make a decision. She observed, analyzed, and remembered. In the fall of 1968, a man named Gene Feldman came to the workshop, 51 years old, an art and antiques dealer from New York City. He was big and loud, with a ruddy face and a gold watch on his wrist. He was in the area on a buying trip, and someone had told him about the Miller sisters' quilts. Feldman walked through the workshop, touching the quilts, making pronouncements about their quality. Nora served him sweet tea, iced, with a sprig of mint, the way they always served it to guests, a Southern tradition. Only this time, there was something else in the tea. Benadryl, 3 crushed tablets. In the 1960s, you could buy it over the counter at any drugstore. Un antihistamine, a mild sedative, harmless unless you took too much. A large dose causes a deep, profound sleep. Feldman drank 2 glasses. Within 20 minutes, his head was nodding. Nora suggested he lie down for a bit. The heat can take it out of you, she said sweetly. You just rest a spell. The quilts aren't going anywhere. She led him to a cot in the back storeroom. Feldman was asleep before his head hit the pillow. 10 minutes later, Clara walked in. She carried a pair of heavy-duty fabric shears, long, narrow blades, sharpened to a razor's edge. One quick, deep thrust into the side of the neck, right into the carotid artery. It was fast and silent. Feldman never woke up. Maeve was waiting with another flawed quilt. This one had a patch of uneven color in the top left corner. They had a whole stack of such quilts in the storeroom. Now it was clear what they were for. They wrapped the body, took the money, $6,200 in cash and the gold watch. His briefcase, filled with his papers, they burned in the old incinerator out back. Feldman didn't have a car. He'd taken a cab from the Savannah airport. That night, the wheelbarrow made another trip. The same dirt road, the same abandoned well. Another dull thud. Feldman never returned to his hotel. His business partners reported him missing after 3 days when he failed to check in. The local police were notified. They checked the hotels, the bus station. The hotel clerk said he'd checked out and taken his bags. It was a lie, but no one bothered to verify it. They figured he'd run off, maybe found a better deal somewhere else. The case went cold. The man was written off, $6,000. It was more than a year's salary for a mill worker. With the money, the sisters bought a new industrial sewing machine for piecing, a huge supply of high-quality cotton from North Carolina, and had the workshop's leaking roof replaced. The money was spent wisely. No luxuries, nothing to raise suspicion. And here, we must pause and remember something important. Gene Feldman was a real person. He was 51 years old. He had a wife in Queens and a daughter in college. He loved Broadway shows and the New York Mets. He called his wife every night when he was on the road. The last time he called was from his hotel in Savannah, the day before he visited the workshop. He told her, "It's hotter than hell down here. I bought you some pecan pralines. Tomorrow, I'm going to look at some quilts, and then I'm coming home." He never came home. His wife searched for him, writing to police departments, to politicians, to anyone who would listen. The replies were always the same. "We are looking into it." But no one was looking. 2 years later, his wife received a death certificate. He was declared legally dead, presumed to be the victim of an accident. His daughter never found out what happened to her father, not until 1984. After Feldman, the machine was in motion. Not immediately. The next murder occurred 18 months later. Then a year after that. The intervals grew shorter, not because the sisters developed a taste for it, but because it became routine, a business model. The method was always the same. Nora would greet the buyer, show them the quilts, and serve them the spiked sweet tea. The buyer would fall asleep. Clara would enter with her shears. Maeve would wrap the body. At night, the wheelbarrow, the dark road, the well. But every case was a human life, cut short in a quiet, sun-dappled courtyard behind a faded sign. 1,000 971. Arsen McKayan, 47 years old, an Armenian antiques dealer from Philadelphia. He came to Harmony Creek specifically because he'd heard about the Miller Sisters workshop, the best folk art in the South. A fellow dealer had told him. Authentic, handmade. They cost a fortune, but you can triple your money back home. McKayan arrived with $5,000 in a leather satchel. He wore a gold ring on his pinky finger. He was charming, with a thick accent. He joked with Nora, showered her with compliments. Eyes like yours, he told her, are a work of art themselves. Nora smiled and served him tea. McKayan fell asleep on the porch swing, not even finishing his glass. At home, Arsen McKayan had a wife, 2 sons, and an elderly mother who, every Sunday, lit a candle at her church for her son's safe return. She lit that candle for 5 years, until the day she died. Her son never came back. 1976. Leonard Stern and Boris Katz, both from New Orleans, both in their 40s. They were smugglers, dealing in high-end antiques and art, selling them to wealthy clients under the table. They drove to Harmony Creek together in a brand new Lincoln Continental. Stern was cautious. Katz was not. Katz liked to drink, and he liked to brag. In a local bar, he told a stranger that he'd come for Quilts, the real deal, and that he had plenty of cash to spend. The stranger recommended the Miller Sisters workshop. They went together. Nora didn't hesitate. She served them both tea. Both men fell asleep. Clara had to work twice that evening. 2 bodies, 2 quilts, 2 bundles for the well. But the Lincoln Continental was a problem. A car isn't a body. A car is visible. A car parked in your driveway for too long makes the neighbors ask questions. And that's when Rusty Callahan appeared. Rusty, 28 years old, a mechanic from a garage on the edge of town, a quiet boy with a cleft lip, a birth defect that, in the small town South, guaranteed a life of loneliness. Girls looked away. Other boys made fun of him. His boss never gave him a raise. Rusty lived alone in a small room behind the garage and could fix anything with an engine. Clara brought him in. How she knew him, the investigation never determined. Maybe he'd fix their old pickup truck. Maybe he'd patch the roof. Clara was never one for talking. They told Rusty, "Drive this car to a scrapyard in Macon. Don't ask where it came from. We'll pay you $300. $300 was 3 months' pay for Rusty. He didn't ask questions. He drove the car, came back on the bus, and collected his money. From then on, whenever a victim had a car, Rusty took care of it. He'd drive it to a chop shop 100 miles away. The license plates were removed, the body was repainted, the engine sold separately. It vanished. Did Rusty understand what was happening? He would later claim in his testimony, "I suspected something, but I didn't ask. They paid me good. Nobody else ever paid me good. I didn't want to know." The court did not believe him. 1979. Janice Ozols, 39 years old, a Latvian-American from Boston, a folklorist and university professor, a leading expert on American textile arts. He was writing a book, The Quilting Traditions of the American South, a symbolic history. He was the only victim who came not for money, but for knowledge. Ozols was thin, tall, and wore thick glasses and a tweed jacket that was completely wrong for the Georgia heat. He spoke quietly, wrote everything down in a little notebook, and took pictures of the quilts with a professional-looking camera. For the first time, Nora hesitated. Ozols was different. He wasn't a hustler or a dealer. He was a scholar. He was quiet, polite, and he genuinely admired the sisters' work. He came to the workshop 3 days in a row, talking to Nora for hours about the patterns, the meaning of the symbols, the dyeing techniques. He wrote down her every word. On the 4th day, he came with money. He wanted to buy a small quilt for his wife. $1,200. It was everything he'd saved for 6 months. Nora served him tea. She would later tell the detective, "I felt sorry for the professor. He was a nice man." But Clara said, "He knows our faces, our names, our address. He'll write his book, and more people like him will come. They'll start asking questions. We can't have that." The cold, impeccable logic of a killer. Janice Ozols never finished his tea. His notebook was burned in the incinerator, along with his tweed jacket and his camera. The book on Southern quilting was never written. In Boston, his wife, Inga, and his 5-year-old daughter, Lima, waited for him. Inga wrote to every authority she could think of for 3 years. In 1982, she received the official notice. He was declared legally dead. Lima grew up without a father. To this day, she doesn't know where he is buried, because there is no grave. Between 1968 and 1984, the Miller sisters murdered 25 people, counting Ray Miller. The total was 26. All men, all from out of town, all carrying large amounts of cash. They came from all over the country: New York, Philadelphia, New Orleans, Boston, Chicago, Detroit, Los Angeles. Men came looking for quilts and never returned. Why did no one connect the disappearances? Because they always came alone. Because business trips in those days could last for weeks. Because communication was slow. There were no cell phones, no email. A long-distance call had to be booked through an operator. A man would disappear, and days, even weeks, would pass before anyone at home began to worry. And when they did, they looked in the wrong places. They checked the big cities, the airports, the hospitals. No one ever thought to look in a small quilting shop on a dead-end street behind a church. And there was another crucial detail. In the public consciousness of that era, serial killers were a new and terrifying phenomenon. Creatures of headlines from California or New York. Not something that happened in quiet, God-fearing southern towns. So when these men vanished, one by one, over the years, no one ever linked the cases. Different cities, different times, different men. There was no common thread. 17 years, 26 people, not a single shred of suspicion, until 1984. Special Agent Victor Pierce, Federal Bureau of Investigation, 42 years old. He worked in counterintelligence, a serious man with a military short haircut and the sharp, observant eyes of someone trained to notice everything. He didn't come to Harmony Creek on official business. It was personal. His mother, a 71-year-old retired schoolteacher in Virginia, had always dreamed of owning a genuine, handmade Southern quilt. She'd seen one in a magazine and talked about it for years. Pierce decided to get her one for her birthday. On October 5th, 1984, he flew from Washington, D.C. to Savannah. He told his wife, "I'll be 2 days, 3 at the most. Get the quilt and come right back." In Harmony Creek, he checked into the Savannah Inn, the only decent hotel in town. He left his credentials and service weapon in the manager's safe, the habit of a professional. He took only cash, $4,000. On the morning of October 6th, he left the hotel. He told the desk clerk, "I'm going to look at some quilts. I'll be back for lunch." He didn't come back for lunch, or for dinner. He wasn't back the next morning. The clerk waited another day. Tourists sometimes did that, took a side trip. On the 3rd day, he called the police. The police took a report and did nothing. A grown man, not drunk, not sick. They'd wait. But Victor Pierce wasn't just a grown man. He was an FBI agent. On October 8th, his wife called his office. They told her he was on personal leave. She called the hotel in Harmony Creek. They told her he hadn't been back in 3 days, but his things were still in his room. On October 9th, the FBI's personnel department contacted the Savannah field office. On the 10th, the call went up the chain to Washington. The wheels of the bureaucracy began to turn. When an FBI agent goes missing, it's not a local matter. It's a federal emergency. On October 12th, Detective Alistair Al Russo, a senior investigator with the Chicago Police Department on loan to a federal task force, was flown to Georgia. He was 47 years old, with 23 years on the job, specializing in the darkest of crimes. He was thin, tough, with a face that looked like it had never learned how to smile. His colleagues called him the janitor because he was the one they called to clean up the worst messes. Russo arrived in Harmony Creek on October 13th. At the county airstrip, he was met by Police Chief Bill Cobb. Cobb looked overwhelmed. In the car on the way into town, he told Russo honestly, "Detective, I don't know what to tell you." The man walked out of his hotel and vanished into thin air. People don't just vanish in Harmony Creek. It's a small town. Everyone's in everyone's business. Russo remained silent. He'd learned a long time ago that when people say that doesn't happen here, it usually means it's been happening for a long time, and no one was paying attention. First, Russo interviewed the hotel staff. The desk clerk remembered that Pierce had asked where to buy a high-quality quilt. He'd recommended 3 places: the open-air market, the arts and crafts co-op, and a private workshop behind the Baptist church. The Miller sisters, the clerk had said, they make the best ones, but they're expensive. Russo wrote it down. It was just one lead among many. He was checking every angle: robbery, an accident, kidnapping, even a foreign intelligence operation. Harmony Creek was a tourist town. You never knew. On October 14th, Russo drove to the old district. He took Chief Cobb, 4 federal agents, and a search warrant. He'd gotten the warrant as a precaution. Formally, he had grounds. It was the last known place the missing person might have gone. Russo didn't expect to find anything. He figured he'd talk to the quilters. Maybe they saw the agent. Maybe they knew where he went next. And then came the scene that began our story. The door, Nora Miller. "Would you gentlemen care for some sweet tea?" Russo entered the workshop and looked around. 2 large quilting frames dominated the main room. Finished quilts hung on the walls and were draped over furniture. Shelves were filled with bolts of fabric and spools of thread. It looked exactly like what it was, a craftsman's workshop. Nothing seemed out of place. He asked the standard questions. Had a man been here about a week ago? Tall, short-hair? Nora answered without hesitation. Yes, he'd been by. Looked at some quilts, didn't buy anything, and left. Her voice was calm and self-assured. Russo made a note. He asked, when? Exactly. Nora gave him the date. October 6th. It matched. He asked where the man had gone. I couldn't say. He mentioned he might look around the market. A standard story, standard answers. Russo could have left then, but he noticed 3 things. First, the smell. A faint, cloyingly sweet odor, unpleasant and out of place. It wasn't cotton or dye or cooking. It was something else. Russo couldn't identify it, but he filed it away. Second, the storeroom. A door in the far wall was partially hidden by a hanging quilt. Nora was standing in a way that subtly blocked the path to it. It wasn't obvious, but Russo noticed. Third, Maeve. The youngest sister sat at a frame in the corner, stitching. When Russo walked in, she looked up, gave him her gentle, vacant smile and said, "It's going to be a beautiful quilt for a beautiful man." The phrase was meaningless, but something in that smile, in its profound wrongness for the situation, made Russo pause. He asked to see the storeroom. Nora said, "It's just our supply closet, sir. Nothing of interest in there." Russo repeated his request, his voice harder now. "Show me the storeroom." Nora didn't move. Clara, who had been sitting silently at the other frame, looked up for the first time, her eyes fixing on the detective with a heavy, unblinking stare. Russo produced the warrant. Nora stepped aside. The storeroom was dark and cramped. A small window was stuffed with rags. Shelves held bundles of batting and yarn, and against the far wall stood a half-dozen rolled-up quilts tied with twine. Russo walked over to the nearest one and touched it. It felt soft, but lumpy, uneven, and it was heavy, far too heavy for just a quilt. He pulled at the edge, unrolling it. 23 years on the force, dozens of murders. But when the face of Special Agent Victor Pierce appeared from beneath the colorful fabric gray, swollen, with dried blood caked on his neck, Russo took an involuntary step back. Then he turned to the agents behind him and said one word: cuff them. Nora didn't resist. Clara didn't resist. Maeve kept stitching. She only stopped when an agent placed a hand on her shoulder. She looked up, smiled, and asked, "Is it over now?" The interrogations began that same day at the county courthouse. A small room on the second floor. A barred window, a table, 2 chairs, a desk lamp, a pitcher of water. Russo preferred to use a pencil for his notes. Pens had a way of running out at the worst possible moments. Clara was a brick wall. Total, absolute silence. They'd bring her in, sit her down, ask her questions. She would sit, stare at the wall, and say nothing. She didn't refuse to answer. She simply did not speak, as if she couldn't hear them, as if they weren't even in the room. Russo questioned her 6 times over 2 weeks. 6 hours of intense interrogation yielded 0 words. Not one. Maeve was questioned twice. The first time, she talked happily about quilts, about patterns, about the difference between a Persian and a Turkish knot, about natural dyes. When asked, "Did you kill people?" she smiled and said, "I wrap the quilts. I wrap them up pretty. Clara says I do it best." A psychiatric evaluation a week later found Maeve to be legally incompetent. The diagnosis? Organic brain damage resulting from a childhood trauma. She either didn't understand what she had done, or she understood it in her own private world, a world with no room for guilt or horror, only for quilts, patterns, and stitches. The one who talked was Nora. And when she talked, even Al Russo, a man accustomed to the darkest confessions, found himself falling silent in the middle of a question. Nora recounted their history calmly, methodically, like an accountant reading an annual report. Date, name, amount, $1,968. Feldman, $6,200. $1,970. Kravchenko, $3.8. $1,971. McKayan, $5,000. $1,974. Saville and Timoshchuk, $7,000 for the 2 of them. She remembered every single one, not by their faces, but by the cash they carried. Russo asked her why. Nora looked at him for a long time, then said, "They'd come in here, these men with their money, and they'd look down on us. They'd touch our work with their dirty hands and try to haggle like it was worthless. One of them said, 'If it's just women's work, it ought to be cheaper.' Another one put his hand on my knee. A third one acted in a way that made Maeve cry all night." She paused. "All our lives, men would just come, take what they wanted, and leave. Our father died, and there was no one to protect us. Our husbands, one abandoned us, the other one beat us. These customers looked at us like we were just part of the inventory. We just made it so they couldn't leave." She looked Russo dead in the eye. It was justice. Russo wrote it down. Underlined the word justice twice. This wasn't justice. It was 20 years of pain, humiliation, and silence, twisted and forged into a system of industrial-scale murder. But for Nora, in her world behind the brick walls of that small town, where a woman was worth less than a quilt, it was the only form of justice she could imagine. To understand is not to condone. That's important. 2 weeks after the sisters' arrest, Russo got his lead on the well. Rusty Callahan, the mechanic with the cleft lip, was picked up on the 3rd day. They tracked him down through the VIN numbers of the cars he'd sold for scrap and Macon. During his interrogation, Rusty broke down completely. He wanted a deal. He talked. The well, behind the old Devereaux plantation, on the road to Millersville, 4 miles out of town. "It's all there," he sobbed. On October 28th, a team of agents, forensics experts, and medical examiners drove out to the site. They brought a cadaver dog, a German shepherd named Atlas. 50 yards from the ruins, Atlas began to bark, straining at his leash, pulling his handler toward a pile of stones overgrown with kudzu. The well was circular, lined with stone, about 4 feet in diameter. It was 14 meters deep. A few rotten planks of wood were laid across the top. And the smell? It was the same sickly sweet smell Russo had noticed in the workshop, but 1,000 times stronger. It took them 3 days to empty it. Ropes, a winch, gas masks. A young forensics tech, a kid of 26, was the first one down. He asked to be pulled back up after 5 minutes. On the surface, he threw up for 20 minutes straight. 25 bundles, rolled in quilts, tied with rope, stacked neatly one on top of the other, like firewood. The ones on top were relatively preserved. The ones at the bottom were decomposed, turning to sludge, falling apart at the touch. Each bundle was a person. They unrolled them right there, in the field, on large plastic tarps. The medical examiners worked for 3 days and nights. Some of the bodies were partially mummified by the dry conditions deep in the well. Some were skeletons wrapped in rotting fabric. Many had clear signs of a stab wound to the neck. One precise strike, left side, carotid artery, Clara's signature. Among the remains, they found remnants of clothing, buttons, belt buckles, the soles of shoes. They found metal objects, coins, keys, gold dental fillings. Using these fragments, forensics teams would eventually identify 22 of the 25 victims from the well. 3 remained anonymous forever. Russo stood off to the side, watching. The 10 minutes he spent behind the wall of the old smokehouse, as mentioned at the start of this story, was not a literary flourish. It was taken directly from Chief Cobb's official report. Detective Russo paused the recovery, walked behind the smokehouse for approximately 10 minutes, then returned and resumed his duties. Chief Cobb, the man who knew the Miller family, who'd bought a quilt from them, couldn't take it. On the 3rd day, he asked to be removed from the case. Russo refused. "You're a local," he said. "I need you. You hold it together." Cobb held it together. But years later, in his retirement, he would say, "Every time I see a handmade quilt, any quilt, I think about that well. Every single time." The mayor of Harmony Creek, a man named Erkin Matthews, tried to suppress the story, not out of malice, but out of fear. 26 murders in his town over 17 years. It was a catastrophic failure. A failure of the police, a failure of the community, a failure of the entire system. Matthews knew heads would roll, and his would be the first. He went to Russo privately. "Al," he said, "do we have to report all 26? Maybe we just say it was 5 or 6 and close the books." Russo looked at him in silence for a long time. Then he said, "Erkin, there are 25 people in that hole, plus the husband. Every one of them was someone's son, someone's husband, someone's father. Every one of them has a family that has spent 20 years not knowing what happened. And you're asking me to leave 19 of them as nameless statistics, to pretend they never existed?" Matthews looked down at his shoes. "I understand, detective, but the order from the governor's office is to keep this quiet. The order from my office," Russo said, "is to find the truth and get justice. I found it. Now there will be a trial for all 26. Matthews left. A month later, he quietly resigned, citing health reasons. But the order to keep it quiet was real. The case was sealed. The court proceedings were closed to the public and the press. The story was deemed too horrific, too sensational for public consumption. A town's pristine image was more important than the truth. The investigation lasted 4 months, from October 1984 to February 1985. Russo stayed in Harmony Creek the entire time. His wife would call once a week. He'd keep it brief. "I'm working." "It's fine. I'll be home soon. Soon stretched into 120 days. The work was painstaking. They had to identify the victims. 25 bodies. 25 life stories cut short in a quilter's storeroom. Some were identified quickly from the documents that Nora had kept. Yes, she had kept them. Not all of them, but some. Passports, driver's licenses, business cards, all neatly stacked and tied with a ribbon, hidden in a loose floorboard beneath her bed. Why? Nora never answered that question. Maybe they were trophies. Maybe it was bookkeeping. Or maybe it was her own twisted way of proving that these men had in fact existed. 22 of the 25 were identified. 3 bodies, the oldest ones from the late 1960s, remained John Doe's. Decomposition had destroyed their faces, their clothes, any identifying marks. No documents, no jewelry. 3 men who were murdered and who nobody had ever come looking for. That might be the most terrifying part of this entire story. Not the 26 deaths, but the 3 who were so completely alone in the world that no one even noticed they were gone. The forensic analysis confirmed it. All the victims died from a single piercing wound to the neck. The weapon was found in the workshop, a simple pair of long, sharp fabric shears, the kind used for cutting through thick layers of cotton. The wooden handle was worn smooth from use. Clara had sharpened them herself every evening on a whetstone, just as her father had taught her. It was a ritual. The toxicology reports on the bodies that could still be tested found traces of diphenhydramine, the active ingredient in Benadryl. The dosage was 3 to 4 times the therapeutic level, enough to put a man into a deep sleep for hours. A sleep so deep he wouldn't wake up, even from the pain of his own death. They didn't feel it. It was the only mercy they were afforded, if you can even call it that. Nora gave her statement 15 times. 15 depositions, each lasting for hours. She spoke in detail, but without emotion. It was as if she were describing how to stitch a quilt. This one came in the spring, she'd say. This one in the fall. This one was rude. This one was polite. This one paid $5,000. This one only $2,000. Once, Russo lost his composure. It was during the 11th interview. Nora was talking about Janis Ozols, the professor from Boston, talking about him in the same detached tone she used for all the others. And Russo interrupted her. "Nora," he said, "this man, Ozols, he wasn't a dealer. He was a scholar. He was writing a book about your art. He admired your work. Didn't you feel anything for him?" Nora was silent for a moment. Then she said, "Detective, I felt sorry for all of them, every single one. But pity is a luxury. We didn't have luxuries. We had quilts to make and 3 mouths to feed." Russo closed his folder and ended the interview 20 minutes early. Later, in his private notes, he would write, "Nora Miller is the most terrifying person I have ever interviewed. Not because of the 26 victims, but because she is completely sane. She's intelligent, calculating, and she sincerely believes she did the right thing. She's not pretending. She's not insane. She believes it. That is what is truly frightening." Rusty Callahan gave a full confession. He told them everything: how many cars he'd disposed of, where, and to whom. 2 of his contacts at the scrapyards were arrested. Rusty cried during his interrogations. "I didn't kill nobody," he wept. "I just drove the cars. I didn't know." Russo would just silently push the confession statements in front of him. Rusty would sign. Did he know? Of course he knew. Cars with no papers that needed to be gotten rid of immediately. Payment in cash. A strict code of silence. He knew. He just chose not to. That isn't innocence, it's cowardice, disguised as ignorance. The trial took place in March of 1985. A closed session. The Superior Court of Georgia convened in the local Harmony Creek courthouse. The courtroom was the repurposed auditorium of the old textile mill. Outside, a police cordon, plainclothes federal agents. Inside, only the participants. No press, no public, no victims' families. The state had decided this was the story the American people did not need to hear. The defendants, Clara Ann Miller and Nora Jean Miller. Maeve was in a state psychiatric hospital deemed unfit to stand trial. Rusty Callahan would be tried separately. The indictment was 147 pages long, 26 counts of first-degree murder. The prosecutor, a man named Nishanov, was an old-school Southern lawyer with a quiet voice, but every word he spoke landed like a hammer blow. He began his opening statement, "Your Honor, before you sit two women, on the surface they are ordinary, quiet, hard-working master artisans. For 17 years, they welcomed men into their home, served them sweet tea, showed them their beautiful quilts, and then they murdered them. 26 men, 26 families who have spent 2 decades not knowing what happened to their husbands, their fathers, their sons. 26 bodies in a well, wrapped in quilts. Your Honor, in all my years, I have never encountered a case of such scale, of such cold-blooded cruelty. I ask for the maximum penalty for both defendants." Clara listened in her usual silence, stone-faced, unmoving. She never once looked at the prosecutor or the judge. She just stared at the wall. Nora listened intently, sometimes nodding, not in agreement, but as if confirming the facts against her own internal ledger. When she was given the chance to make a final statement, she stood and said, "I'm not asking for mercy. We did what we did, but I want to say one thing. Every one of those men came to our workshop on their own, with their money, wanting to buy something beautiful. They didn't think about us, who we were, what our lives were like. To them, we were just the help. The women at the quilting frame, not one of them ever asked our names. Not one. In 17 years. She paused. Now they know, and so do you." She sat down. The courtroom was silent. The verdict was delivered on March 22nd, 1985. Clara Ann Miller, guilty on all counts. Sentence, death by electrocution. Nora Jean Miller, guilty on all counts. Sentence, death by electrocution. The execution of women was extremely rare in the United States, but the sheer scale of their crimes left the court with no other option. Rusty Callahan was later convicted of being an accessory to murder and sentenced to 12 years in a maximum security prison. His cooperation was taken into account. Their appeals were denied. The sentence was carried out in the summer of 1985. Where and how was not reported. The state does not publicize such things. It's not an event. It's a line in a file. Sentence carried out. Date. Signature. Clara Miller never spoke another word from the day of her arrest to the very end. She went to her death in silence. Nora, according to a guard, had only one last request. "Tell Maeve," she said, "to finish the quilt. The one with the blue pattern. It's almost done." The quilt was never finished. Maeve Miller was committed to a state psychiatric hospital for the criminally insane. The official diagnosis was an organic personality disorder with severe cognitive defects. She lived in that hospital for 8 years. According to the staff, she was a quiet, docile patient. She never caused any trouble. She just quilted. They gave her scraps of fabric, old bedsheets, and thread, and she quilted. She made small squares, about a foot by a foot, with intricate patterns. A new one every day. The patterns were strange. Not traditional designs, but something else. Repeating shapes that looked like human figures, but they were distorted, elongated, without faces. One of the orderlies said, "It looks like people, all wrapped up." The psychiatrists studied her quilts, wrote papers about them for internal review. One of their conclusions read, "The patient is recreating her traumatic experiences through the only medium available to her. The patterns are an unconscious projection of the acts committed." Maeve died in 1992, peacefully, in her sleep. She was 61. A nurse found her in the morning, lying on her side, her hands folded as if holding a needle and thread. On her nightstand was her last quilt square, unfinished. She was buried in the hospital cemetery, under a small stone marker with no name, only a number. And what of those left behind? The families of the victims only learned the truth in 1984, when Detective Russo personally contacted each one. 22 phone calls, 22 conversations that all began with the words, "I'm calling about your husband." The wife of Gene Feldman, the first victim after Ray, had remarried. She listened to Russo in silence, then said, "I knew it. I felt it. Gene would never have just left without calling. He always called." She cried. Her second husband stood beside her, helpless. Feldman's daughter, by then the assistant manager of a department store, was 43. She had spent 20 years believing her father had abandoned his family. When she learned the truth, she didn't leave her apartment for a week. Inga Ozols, the wife of the Latvian professor, was still living alone in Boston. Her daughter, Lema, had grown up and moved away. Inga received a letter from Russo. He hadn't been able to reach her by phone. She wrote back, "Thank you for finding him. Thank you for telling me. Now, at last, I can have a funeral." But there was nothing to bury. The remains of the victims that were not claimed by family were interred in a mass unmarked grave in a cemetery outside Harmony Creek. Just a concrete slab with a plot number. Detective Russo closed the case in May of 1985 and returned to Chicago. He received a commendation and went back to work. He retired in 1991. The Miller sisters case was the one he never spoke about. Only once, in 2004, when he was 67 and dying of lung cancer, did he tell the full story. He told it to his grandson, a 20-year-old journalism student, who recorded it on a cassette tape. Russo spoke for 3 hours without a break, recounting every detail. His voice only faltered when he described the well. 25 bundles, Russo said on the tape. Neat, tidy, tied with rope, like inventory in a warehouse. That's the part I can't forget. Not the bodies, not the smell, the neatness. They did it neatly, the same way they stitched their quilts. The workshop was demolished in 1986 by order of the town council. The official reason was that the building was structurally unsound. First, the lot was empty. Then it became a parking lot. Now, there's a cafe there. The owner has no idea about the history of the ground his customers sit on. The well was filled in that same year. Dirt, rocks, construction debris. A concrete slab was poured over the top. Its coordinates exist only in a sealed file somewhere in a state archive. 26 quilts, 26 lives. Each of those men woke up one morning, got dressed, and traveled to Harmony Creek. Each one walked the narrow streets of the old town, squinting in the Georgia sun. Each one pushed open a peeling blue door and stepped into a workshop. Each one saw the beautiful, intricate, stunning quilts. Each one was offered a glass of sweet tea. Each one thought, "What a lovely place." And each one of them never left. What pushes a person to murder? Is it need? Hate? Despair? Or is it silence? The kind of silence that allows a secret to fester for years, for decades, because no one ever asks, no one ever looks too closely, no one ever notices. The Miller sisters were not monsters born of fantasy. They were human beings broken, damaged, and twisted by their circumstances, but human. And that is the true horror of this story. The horror isn't in the well, or in the quilts, or in the sharpened shears. It's in the realization that this could have happened anywhere, on any dead-end street, behind any door, in any quiet place where no one is watching, and no one is asking questions. 26 people, 40 years of silence, one old detective, and one cassette tape. Now you know